November 11th, 1940. The Gulf of Taranto, southern Italy. In the early years of the Second World War, at 2258, 12 fabric-covered biplanes crossed the harbor boom of the most heavily defended naval base in the Mediterranean. Their design is 6 years old. Their top speed, with a torpedo slung underneath, is roughly 138 miles per hour, slower than the fighters that ended the First World War. Below them lie 6 Italian battleships, protected by 21 anti-aircraft batteries, more than 200 smaller guns, and a partial ring of barrage balloons. By the time the second wave clears the harbor 90 minutes later, 3 of those battleships are on the bottom or settling into the mud. 2 will never fight again in the condition they were in that afternoon. 1 will never fight again at all. The Royal Navy has lost 2 aircraft and 4 men. In a single night, 21 obsolete biplanes have halved the operational battle line of the Regia Marina, a result no surface fleet in the world could have produced without a general engagement and thousands of casualties. 6 months later, the same aircraft type will jam the rudders of the most powerful battleship afloat and hand the Bismarck to the guns of the home fleet. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. How did an open cockpit biplane, already considered outdated the year it entered service, become the most destructive naval strike aircraft Britain fielded in the Second World War? The answer has almost nothing to do with speed. It begins with an argument between the Admiralty and the Air Ministry that had been running since 1918. Between 1918 and 1937, the Fleet Air Arm was not controlled by the Royal Navy. It belonged to the Royal Air Force. Aircraft procurement, pilot training, doctrine, and funding were set by an organization whose strategic priorities were strategic bombing and home defense, not fleet strike. The consequence was structural. While the United States and Japan spent the 1930s developing fast monoplane torpedo bombers and dive bombers built around carrier operations, Britain's carrier aircraft were specified to a much narrower requirement. The Fairey Company's answer was the TSR: torpedo, spotter, reconnaissance. 1 airframe, 3 jobs. It first flew as the TSR-2 prototype on the 17th of April 1934 and entered frontline service in July 1936 as the Swordfish Mark I. On paper, it was already a generation behind. It was a biplane in the age of the monoplane, with a fixed undercarriage, an open cockpit, a fabric-covered steel-tube fuselage, and a single Bristol Pegasus 3 radial engine producing about 690 horsepower. Maximum speed, clean, was around 139 miles per hour. With an 18-inch Mark XII torpedo weighing 1,610 pounds slung between its wheels, cruising speed for the attack run fell to roughly 85 to 90 knots. Aircrew called it the Stringbag, not because it was flimsy, but because, like a housewife's string shopping bag, it could apparently be made to carry anything. That is where most comparisons of the Swordfish stop, and it is the wrong place to stop. Every specification that made the aircraft look outdated on a comparison table made it lethal in the conditions the Royal Navy actually had to fight in. Start with a wing. The Swordfish had a wing area of 607 square feet, carrying a loaded weight of roughly 9,250 pounds. That is a very low wing loading, about 15 pounds per square foot, less than half that of a contemporary monoplane torpedo bomber. The practical result was a stalling speed in the region of 55 to 60 miles per hour, with control authority that held almost all the way down to it. A Swordfish could be flown deliberately, accurately, and repeatedly at speeds where a faster aircraft would simply fall out of the sky. That one characteristic solved the 2 hardest problems in carrier torpedo work. The first was launch and recovery. A fleet carrier steaming into a 25-knot wind gave the Swordfish most of its flying speed before it had accelerated at all. which meant it could be flown off in weather that grounded everything else afloat. The second was weapons delivery. The British 18-inch Mark XII torpedo of the period had to be dropped low and slow, broadly under 100 feet and under 100 knots, or it broached, ran deep, or broke up on entry. A faster aircraft had to bleed off speed to release, spending long seconds straight and level inside the defensive fire. The Swordfish was already there. The aircraft's most obvious weakness was its delivery envelope. There is a second advantage that is worth stating carefully, because it is often overstated. German and Italian shipboard anti-aircraft fire control of the period computed a firing solution by assuming a target crossing at a given rate. Several British accounts and post-war analyses drawing on them argue that an aircraft attacking at 85 knots flew below the minimum tracking speeds those predictors were calibrated for, so heavy caliber fire tended to burst ahead of it. That is a contemporary operational claim rather than a settled measurement, and the Swordfish was in fact shot down in large numbers when it attacked defended targets in daylight without surprise. What is not in dispute is the record of the two operations that made its reputation, and in both of them, the Fleet Air Arm attacked at night or in bad weather. That was a doctrinal decision by the Navy, not a property of the airframe. The February 1942 Channel Dash made exactly that point in the starkest possible terms. When 6 Swordfish of 825 Naval Air Squadron attacked the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prince Eugen in full daylight through heavy fighter cover and concentrated anti-aircraft fire, every aircraft was shot down, and only 5 of 18 aircrew survived. The same type, the same torpedoes, a different doctrine, a catastrophic result. Night and bad weather were not incidental to the Swordfish's success. They were the operational condition without which it had no survivability at all. If you are finding this look at Fleet Air Arm doctrine worthwhile, subscribing takes a second and genuinely helps the channel. Operation Judgement had been on the Admiralty's shelf in one form or another since 1935. The plan was rehearsed, shelved, revived, and finally executed under Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, with the tactical carrier operation planned and commanded by Rear Admiral Lumley Lister aboard HMS Illustrious, a new armoured carrier, in November 1940. Lister had been refining the Taranto concept since his time commanding HMS Glorious in the Mediterranean, and it was his insistence on the operational feasibility of the shallow water attack that kept the plan alive. The Italian fleet at Taranto was under the overall command of Admiral Inigo Campioni, and the Regia Marina considered the harbour's defences sufficient protection. The tactical problem was that Taranto's harbours were shallow. The Mar Grande, where the battleships lay, was around 39 feet deep. A standard air-dropped torpedo dived far below that on entry and buried itself in the mud. The solution was engineering rather than courage. The torpedoes were fitted with additional fins and released in a shallow, carefully controlled attitude so that the initial dive was arrested, and they carried duplex magnetic pistols, a detonating mechanism designed to trigger beneath a ship's keel rather than against her side armor. Reconnaissance was flown by RAF Marylands from Malta right up to the day of the attack, so the Fleet Air Arm knew the exact berthing plan of every capital ship before it launched. 21 Swordfish went in 2 waves, on the night of the 11th to 12th of November. The first wave was drawn primarily from 815 Naval Air Squadron, the second from 819 Naval Air Squadron. 11 carried torpedoes, the rest carried bombs and flares, and their job was to illuminate the anchorage from the seaward side so the torpedo aircraft attacked out of the dark against backlit targets. The new battleship Littorio, commissioned that same year, took 3 torpedo hits and settled by the bow. The Conte di Cavour took 1 and sank at her moorings. She was refloated in 1941, but never returned to operational service. The Caio Duilio took one hit forward and was beached to stop her sinking, out of the war for months. 2 Swordfish were lost, 2 aircrew were killed, and 2 taken prisoner. Within days, the Regia Marina moved its surviving heavy units from Taranto to Naples, giving up forward basing in the central Mediterranean at the moment Britain most needed the Malta convoy route. Cunningham's own assessment was that the night of the 11th of November should be remembered as having shown once and for all that in the fleet air arm, the Navy possessed its most devastating weapon. The arithmetic behind that judgment is what matters. A battleship represented years of construction and thousands of tons of steel. The strike that removed 3 of them from the Italian order of battle in 90 minutes was flown by 21 aircraft of a type that every air staff in the world already considered out of date. 5 months later, in March 1941, Swordfish from the Fleet Air Arm contributed to the Battle of Cape Matapan. A torpedo hit on the Italian heavy cruiser Pola, delivered by an aircraft from HMS Formidable, left her dead in the water and triggered the chain of events that led Admiral Iachino's squadron to turn back in search of her. Cunningham's surface fleet caught the Italians at night and sank 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. The Swordfish did not fight the Battle of Matapan, but without the torpedo that stopped the Pola, there was no battle. That is the pattern: enabling conditions set by a slow biplane, consequences settled by other means. The second proof of the aircraft itself came on the 26th of May 1941. The Bismarck, having sunk HMS Hood and shaken off the shadowing cruisers, was running for Saint-Nazaire and was very nearly out of reach. Force H's carrier, Ark Royal, operating out of Gibraltar, was in an Atlantic gale with a flight deck reported to be pitching through more than 50 feet. No other carrier aircraft in service could have been flown off in those conditions. The Swordfish was flown off twice in one afternoon. The first strike is the more instructive of the two. 15 aircraft attacked a radar contact that turned out to be the British cruiser Sheffield. No hits were scored, and several torpedoes detonated prematurely on hitting the water. Those torpedoes were fitted with duplex magnetic pistols. For the second strike, the pistols were changed to contact. That single decision, made in under 2 hours by men who had just made the worst mistake of their careers, is the reason the Bismarck was caught. The second strike of 15 Swordfish attacked at dusk in worsening weather and scored 2 or 3 hits. One struck the stern and jammed the rudders roughly 12 degrees to port. Bismarck, the most heavily protected warship afloat, could now only steam in a slow curve back toward the pursuing home fleet. Every aircraft of that strike returned to Ark Royal, several of them badly damaged. The following morning, Rodney and King George V finished what the biplanes had started. The measurable proof of the design ran on long after both events. The Swordfish's intended replacement, the Fairey Albacore, was a faster design with an enclosed cockpit, ordered specifically to succeed it. The Albacore entered service in 1940 and was withdrawn from frontline use in 1943. The Swordfish outlived it and stayed operational until the end of the war in Europe in 1945. Roughly 2,391 were built, the great majority by Blackburn at Sherburn in Elmet, after Fairey's capacity was needed elsewhere. In the second half of the war, the type changed role entirely. It flew from merchant aircraft carriers and escort carriers on the Atlantic and Arctic convoy routes, armed with ASV radar, depth charges, and rocket projectiles, hunting U-boats from decks barely 400 feet long that no faster aircraft could safely use. It is credited with a share in the destruction of more Axis submarines and merchant tonnage than any other British naval aircraft of the war. What the Swordfish demonstrates is narrower than the idea that old equipment is secretly good. Fast and slow, modern and obsolete, mean very little on their own. A weapon is matched or mismatched to a specific operational problem, and the problem here was delivering a fragile 18-inch torpedo at night in bad weather from a moving deck against a defended anchorage. Measured against the problem the Royal Navy actually faced in 1940, the aircraft that looked most out of date on paper was the only one in the world capable of solving it. Taranto was studied closely in Tokyo, and 13 months later, the same principle of shallow water torpedoes, a night approach, and carrier aircraft against battleships at anchor was applied at Pearl Harbor on a far larger scale. The biplane everyone had written off settled the argument about whether the capital ship or the carrier aircraft would decide the war at sea, and it settled it at 85 knots.